All right, welcome to today's podcast. So normally what I end up doing from a monologue perspective is I'll pick a topic and I'll just have a conversation here. But in today's podcast episode, I wanted to take a page out of like the storytelling book, or if you will, the newsletter book, and tell you about, just like the podcast episode says, just like the podcast episode title says, the deadliest place in America to work at. Now, in Phenix City, Alabama, there was a place called Phenix Lumber, a lumber mill. If you haven't been to a lumber mill, then you're unaware of just how dangerous a lumber mill can be. Certainly, as they are notorious for just patching things back together because, at the end of the day, these places are trying to make money. But Phenix Lumber takes things to a whole other level. Or at least they did. So I'm going to, in large part, read from the Washington Post. And I'll have it linked into the description so that you can go ahead and check the veracity. But as a safety manager, somebody who has been I'm a Union Iron worker and have been one for almost 25 years now, I'm very well aware of the things that I need to be, cognizant of that are on the job site. Things that when you do an OSHA class, they'll tell you an OSHA 10 or a 30, the purpose of it is to raise hazard awareness. That purpose for that specific, the purpose of an OSHA class is to raise hazard awareness. They'll tell you that. Well, when I go on a job site, I'm always trying to, have my antennae up and looking for things that I know to be very unsafe. And I'm very intentional about that. Not everybody is, though. In fact, some people view safety, certainly on the management side or the production side, as something that handcuffs and keeps people away from being the most productive that they can be. And to some degree, they are right. Because safety takes an investment in the company, monetarily, intentionally, from a human resource perspective as well. Safety does indeed mean I need to be intentional about what I am doing with my human resources, rather than viewing them as a tool that when the tool gets dull, I'll just chuck them out of the way and go get a brand new tool. Instead, many companies who are actually vested in the safety of their employees, and intentionally so, what they do then is they look at them and they say, how can I keep these individuals safe? And then you have places like Phenix Lumber, which was dubbed the most dangerous or deadliest workplace in America. Now, when you scroll through this Washington Post article, and again, I'm not going to read the entire thing. I don't want any copyright infringement or anything like that. But when I look at some of the things here, quote, at Phenix Lumber Company, workers had lost fingers, broken bones, and been mangled by machines. At least 28 employees had reported injuries since 2010. At a company with only about 50 people on the payroll at a time. 3 had died. A medical examiner's report detailed how just 23 pounds of one employee was recovered after he was caught in a machine. It had reached a point, some former workers said, that they would pray before the start of their $9 an hour shifts. Phenix Lumber was the deadliest workplace in America over the past 5 years. No other office or factory posted a higher rate of work-related fatal incidents per worker, according to a Washington Post analysis of Occupational Safety and Health Administration fatality reports since 2019. The analysis examined deaths by workplace location rather than by company, using OSHA data on fatalities investigated by the agency, which generally does not cover small farms or federal workers. This is bananas. And I'm going to go back and repeat the numbers in case you were actively doing something else and they escaped your attention. At least 28 employees had reported injuries since 2010 at a company with only about 50 people on the payroll at a time. 3 of them had died. A medical examiner's report detailed how just 23 pounds of one employee was recovered. And many of them would pray before they went to work at their $9 an hour shifts. So what you have here, because they call it the deadliest workplace in America, what you have here in Phenix Lumber is a classic case of exploitation and complete disregard for any and all safety protocol when it came to employees, along with their ability to go home at the end of the day, just like they came back to work. It's pure, unadulterated exploitation. That's what that is. And might I remind you that this took place all while there is an OSHA, an entity that is known to protect the lives of workers when they go to work. And even with that, and even with the rules, and even with the regulations, you still have a place like Phenix Lumber. That is absolutely bananas. What the take home for you, quite frankly, among many other things that we'll discuss as our podcast, this particular podcast episode continues on, is if this is how bad some places are and how they're able to fly, quote unquote, under the radar when OSHA exists, imagine what would happen if certain individuals got their way to abolish OSHA. That is bananas. 28 employees have reported injuries, 3 had died, and just 23 pounds of somebody could be found. You're talking about a place that had severe lockout, tagout issues. We're going to work on live, energized equipment. We're not going to have any handrail. We're not going to have any tie-off, guards, etc. Enormously gross negligence on the fact of the company. And here we go. To continue in the Washington Post article, all of the data that they gathered up, and kudos to, real quick, just so I can give him a good shout out, Todd Frankel. Todd Frankel has done what I would say is some great investigative journalism when it comes to exposing a company like this. The story of Phenix Lumber, drawn from thousands of previously undisclosed documents and recordings obtained by the Post, along with interviews with officials and former workers and managers, shows the limits of OSHA's power. It cannot shut down companies even after years of repeated violations and penalties, even when workers die. It even lacks the power to ask a judge to do so. How about that? That is amazing. It cannot request a shutdown for only for imminent damage or imminent danger, excuse me. So when you look at the hierarchy of things, imminent danger it's given priority, and the reality is there's a reason for that, right? Imminent danger means this person hasn't died yet, but it's very likely that things could happen that lead that direction. So we have an opportunity to save that life. Let's go in here from an imminent danger perspective. But I have said this from time to time on this platform that what has ultimately taken place is that our labor law on the Department of Labor side, from the National Labor Relations Board, from the Act to the board to the Department of Labor itself, have all been watered down and are weak. So too is the enforcement arm when it comes to protecting America's workers. OSHA does not have, in my estimation, the authority that they should. And I might add, their fines are not steep enough. I've said this before, and I had a petition to raise, if you will, the penalties for child exploitation or child labor violations. Because if you have a company, and you can make this case about child labor, you can make it about using undocumented or illegal people in the country. You could use it, whatever law you're breaking, it doesn't really matter. It would not matter to me at any given stage. But if you had a law that was being broken, and in this case we're talking about OSHA, but in that case we're talking about any of those other things, if the penalty for that is not steep, is not stiff, is not punitive, then you're not doing anything except incentivizing that company, that firm, those individuals. You're incentivizing them to break that law. That's what you're ultimately doing, is you are incentivizing them. Why? Because, how many times can I get away with this versus how many times might I get caught? In this case, from an OSHA perspective, how many times might I get caught? And even if I do, what are the fines? They're nothing to me. You hit me with a repeated or serious violation or willful, but then it gets negotiated and watered down through the informal process and all this other stuff, and I can just go right back to how I've been working and how I've been operating. And you know what has happened because OSHA, let's say, lacks the authority to deal with a Phenix Lumber? The law has effectively incentivized a company like Phenix Lumber to break it. And the reason why is because the fines or the punishment doesn't fit the crime. It's too weak. It's too feckless. It doesn't have merit. It doesn't have any teeth. It's interesting also when it comes to Phenix, again, even in the very rare case that you are the bad actor, you are the bad apple, that actually, just continually gets bombarded. So in a time frame of about 22 years, give or take, there were 180 citations for health and safety violations. 180. Nearly to the tune of 5.3 million. Doing some quick math, you get about $29,000 approximately per violation. But 180? This is Phenix Lumber. This is what they did. Yeah. And outside of the 5.3 million and 180 safety violations, when the last death that prompted, let's say that prompted this article, there's internal dialogue between body cam of police who are like, I hate being in this place. An attorney for the lumber mill said in a court filing after James Streetman was a maintenance supervisor there. He was about 67 years old, and it was an auger that was not, it was clogged. They had their assumption, because they were frantically working to try to unclog it without being locked out. Mind you, lockout tagout, for those of you who are unaware, is where you lock out. You de-energize equipment and you put a lock on it so it cannot be energized or fired up while people are working on it, so that you don't have specific instances and incidents like what happened to James Streetman. While they were trying to clear out what they believed to be an obstruction, an auger turned on. And no one really knows whether or not he was standing on the auger when it turned on, or whether or not he, fell from a small little rickety bullcrap platform into the auger. But an attorney for the lumber mill said in a court filing after Streetman's death that his, quote, negligence proximately contributed to cause the accident resulting in his death, end quote. The company has rejected accusations of wrongdoing in court filings. The Dudley family, who happened to own this, and a top manager all declined to comment, through representatives, or did not respond to multiple requests for comment. When you have 180 separate violations that were issued from approximately 2003 onward, you don't get to actually be taking seriously when you say something to the effect of, well, it was his negligence that helped cause this. When a company ethos, or a company culture, if you will, is so reckless to warrant over almost 5.3 million and 180 health and safety citations. So they're gaslighting in that regard. They're scapegoating, looking for someone to pin the blame on, because it's bananas. Another thing that makes Phenix Lumber one of the most dangerous places one of the most deadliest places, or the deadliest place to actually work. When you look at the sheer number of how many, full-time workers are out in this workforce, how many full-time places are out there, and how many OSHA investigators there are. Interestingly enough, about, let's say 8 million approximately, OSHA started making almost yearly visits to Phenix Lumber from 2 decades before it was actually shut down. It is crazy to think that in this day and age, a company can be as reckless as Phenix Lumber was when it comes to a blatant disregard for human resources and safety protocols at all, and can still continually work and endanger people's lives. But that's not just the end of it. There's a significant number of things that went through, right? Other incidents that make Phenix Lumber the most dangerous place in America to work. There was a worker who was killed, and the way he was killed was when they had his head was crushed, basically, when a motor that was rigged off of a forklift jumped up, probably because the mast was into something, and the motor jumped up, and his head happened to be sitting in a certain spot where the motor knocked his head into a beam and crushed him. He went to the hospital, and he died 6 days later as he was sitting there in the hospital bleeding out. Not too long after that, a worker fell 10 foot through a hole on a platform. They brought this all together. OSHA just I mean, it was so close on the heels of that one worker dying that this other worker, when he fell, they investigated that and they lumped it all together for a fine of $493,400, but that was for 53 violations. 53 violations. Another, because they had a lockout tagout problem, like I said, another worker needed 30 stitches on one of his hands. Why? Because a machine, because if you ever worked at a lumber mill, you'll know this, or any kind of pulp and paper, especially lumber mill. What happens is some of those machines get really rough as you're debarking and cutting, and sometimes it get clogged up with stuff, sawdust, etc. And one of the machines got clogged, and if you don't lock it out and tag it out so that nobody can cut it on, would reach his hand in there, and of course to unclog something, and this time something ended up catching his hand, and so he needed 30 stitches. You had amazingly management at the actual place saying things like, quote, "They are lazy and don't want to," meaning they don't want to follow safety rules, as if to say it's not on. We're trying, from a Phenix Lumber perspective, we're trying to get these people to be safe. They don't care. They're lazy. They don't want to follow safety protocols. Talk about ultimate gaslighting. At this, OSHA added them to what they call their severe violator enforcement program. It's where they basically call out bad players for who they actually are. These are the people, if you will, and I can broad brush, but these are the people, if you will, that consistently they're gamblers, because we'll just roll the dice, and if I can get by with what I can get by and only get my hand slapped when I get my hand slapped, and just kind of push off and cry poverty and cry safety and gaslight and say these people that I'm working at $9 an hour are, too lazy and they don't want to follow suit and they don't want to do their due diligence and safety, etc. That's a problem. That's a very serious problem. And so OSHA added them to their severe violator enforcement program. Crazy. In 2015, all right, there was a head wound. Somebody sustained a head wound there. You had a broken ankle. You had a broke shin. And then somebody had severe burns. Somebody was severely burned on the job. And it just seems like it seemed like it was one thing after another that continued to happen. After that, 2 more workers died. And then in 2023, the last worker, James Streetman, 67, mill worker, supervisor, in the attempt to unclog a pipe that would get clogged periodically, you have to step over the auger, over the handrail, rickety as it was, to get to this little small platform to get to this pipe, or to get to an area where you can attempt to unclog it. And it's unclear whether or not it's unclear whether the auger turned on and he was standing on it as he was transferring over, or whether he slipped and fell. But the standard industry protocol, for those of you who are unaware, is, as I said earlier, to lock the equipment out and to tag it out so that people can see that you are working near this. And the reason why is because no amount of money is worth somebody going to work and not coming home that same day due to negligence, due to whatever is taking place in this instance. And yet, whether or not he was standing on the auger, or whether or not he fell into it as he was, doing what he, quite frankly, should not have been doing, which is trying to unclog something and get around what we should have been doing, which is locking the tag out, he died. on the job. And as many times as OSHA, because they would go there every year, they added out of 8 million workplaces, they added them on their severe violator enforcement program. We're going to go there every year. And out of all of the fines, out of all the things that OSHA was doing, and they don't recommend you, they have so little, let's say, teeth when it comes to enforcement. You can't shut a place down. You can recommend things for court cases, but it's so rare. And out of all of that, after all of the injuries and the deaths that have occurred at Phenix Lumber, you know what shut them down? What actually shut the most dangerous place in America to work down? I'll go back to the Washington Post article, and it says, quote, that changed, or the way that the city council and the mayor were looking at Phenix Lumber, because it was bringing, they were employing people. That changed after city firefighters responding to Streetman's death noticed a plastic pipe hooked to a yellow fire hydrant on the property. According to city officials, the mill appeared to be illegally tapping city water. A municipal investigation calculated that the mill owed Phenix City nearly $3.8 million in water and sewage fees, more than what Phenix Lumber had paid OSHA in fines over the years. City officials then took federal regulators couldn't. They issued a cease and desist order that immediately closed down Phenix Lumber. The lumber mill couldn't reopen until the building and fire code problems, such as the lack of proper permits and a sprinkler system, were fixed, and the city was paid for the allegedly stolen water. And after that, after a cease and desist letter is given to them, after, the city firefighters discovering that you are stealing water, they were, you can't make this up. You could not make up a fictional story that was as astounding as this one here. And after all of that, through city council meetings and arguments, etc., the attorney for the mill told the city that your cease and desist letter was not a pro-business decision. How about that? You can't even follow through with what you have the authority to do, which is to tell you, hey, you need to pay us back for the amount of water that you have stolen from this city as it's been processed, and bring your building up to code with sprinkler systems. And then not even to mention all of the accidents, injuries and illnesses, etc. And your default response is you, the city, telling us to stop, to cease and desist, is not a pro-business decision. If there was ever a clearer cut example of a company that does not care about the actual city around it and the people who are working there, then I want you to show me, because this is one that is just, it's flabbergasting to think about it. And interestingly enough, he said, the same attorney, this is not a pro-business decision. He said he'd hired folks, or the mill had hired folks that other folks wouldn't hire or won't hire. Let me translate that for you, for those of you who are not reading this and have not looked in depth into what that meant. What he is saying is, We have hired folks that other people won't hire. We're hiring them so we can pay them $9 an hour so that we can exploit them. So that on one hand, we can keep them being unsafe. And on the other, sit here and tell you as you're investigating that these folks are lazy and they don't want to try and be safe. They don't want to follow the rules. They want in other words, Phenix Lumber wanted their cake and eat it too. What an amazing, amazing display, an example of a company that had complete and total disregard for the way that they handled their employees and even their city relationships. And they had a knockdown, drag out fight, and the total end of it all, the mill closed. The mill closed. And then they filed for bankruptcy. And they pled poverty. And they said, we have assets that are about $50,000. And we have liabilities of more than $50 million. And this also included $2.47 million in OSHA penalties in James Streetman's death. And approximately $3.78 million in stolen water from the city that they never paid for. What a phenomenal story of complete and utter disregard that companies have. Not all companies, but certainly there are bad actors out there. And those bad actors paint the picture of just how necessary OSHA is. And hopefully make you think that if this is how a company can operate with OSHA in existence, with the extent of whatever power people believe them to have right now, imagine what they would be like if there was no OSHA. Do we need less enforcement? No. No, I don't believe so. I believe we need more. I believe we need stiffer fines where the punishment fits the crime and disincentivizes people from continuing to break the law and makes them pay and not try to gaslight people by saying things like they are too lazy to follow safety rules, and then try and look at the city council and a mayor and say, this is not a pro-business decision. Translation, you should let us do whatever we want. It is my hope through this podcast episode that your hazard awareness will be heightened just a little bit more as you go to your place of employment and you work around there, and that you think to yourself, if I work for a good company, everybody can always improve. But if I work for a good company that provides you a PPE, that you wear it and you wear it appropriately. And be grateful that you don't work for a Phenix Lumber. And for those of you who quite literally do work for companies that approach job site safety like Phenix Lumber, leave while you still can. There are other places to work, and your life isn't worth the risk and or gamble. Phenix Lumber, was the deadliest place to work in America that had over 180 citations for health and safety to the tune of over $5 million. And yet, through all of the enforcement, it was the fact that they noticed stolen water through an illegally tapped fire hydrant that made them ultimately shut down. And there it is. If you happen to, and lastly, I'll just conclude the podcast with this. If you work for a company that is in complete and total disregard for safety issues, they're a bad actor. They don't care. You know, maybe they're not mitigating or taking care of or removing lead paint. And they're exposing you and other coworkers to lead poisoning. Maybe they're exposing you to asbestos, knowingly exposing you. Maybe they're charging you for PPE, which they should not be, by the way. Maybe, just maybe, they're exploiting you significantly. I'd love to have a conversation with you. I'd love to offer you the opportunity to share your story, because that's how we make changes, is that we have conversations and raise awareness. If nobody knows what's going on, if nobody knows that the company that you're working for or the industry that you're in, that the contractor you're working for is in total disregard for human safety, how can we even begin to try to change things? So if that describes you and your situation, then I'd love to have a conversation and to offer you the opportunity to come on this platform and tell me and the listeners your story. And there it is. Phenix Lumber, the most dangerous place in America. Somebody else is going to take its spot. I wonder who it'll be. Thank you for taking your time to listen to this podcast episode. I hope it makes you grateful for the good companies that are out there. And as always, when you go to work and whatever it is that you're doing, stay safe out there. I'll see everybody on the next one.